assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
To try and sound like
free and uncorrupted communication.
We're led by visions and myths and promises of better worlds that we all dream about. I, too, growing up, was fascinated by Heinlein and the world of science fiction. And I think it's interesting that as we grow up and take different paths, either as scientists, engineers, social scientists, writers, we all should remember those myths, those dreams, those visions, and understand that we all work to that common good and all work to realizing those visions. I'm going to give my own spin on the role of this center and the role that nanotechnology can play in building that new golden world. There is a reason for this title, The World is Flat, Nanostyle. I'm going to talk about avian flu, silver band-aids, and the promises of nanotechnology for society. And trust me, there is a reason, there is a place for all of these. Barbara's already told you about nanotechnology, about research at the atomic molecular scale, 1 to 100 nanometers, and some novel properties that belong to materials at those particular scales. I show you here some images of molecules at 1 nanometer, DNA at 10 nanometers, and clustered DNA in a form called chromatin, which is how it appears in your nucleus at 100 nanometers. Those are images from powers of 10 that you can access on the web. But I think many of us who've worked in this nano realize that maybe the title nanotechnology, a billionth of a meter, is misleading and diverting, because nanotechnology has to be more than just about size alone. If it were just size alone, and we're talking about atoms and molecules, then you could easily ask, what's new? Don't atomic physicists or molecular biologists or biochemists work on that? Haven't the secrets of more than molecules, but the nucleus and subatomic particles been probed long since? Well, what's new is that we now, at this point in time, have an understanding and availability to nanoscale building blocks with exceptional properties. And I show you some of these nanoscale building blocks. So they're at a dimension which is small, but large enough to have some interesting, powerful, emergent properties of their own. And yet they're not so big that when we cluster them together in ways that perhaps nature never thought of, they're not so big that they don't mingle and change and morph into interesting new properties that come in the aggregate. So leftmost is DNA. The typical width of that double helix is 2 nanometers. I think we're all aware of the immense information capabilities, the coding for everything living that's inherent in DNA. So very small but extremely powerful. In the middle is carbon nanotubes, sort of a poster child for nanotechnology, where typical diameter of the carbon nanotube is 1 to 2 nanometers. Now, these carbon nanotubes are made entirely of carbon, as the name says, but in a particular beautiful symmetries, and the symmetries of how the carbon atoms are bound into those carbon nanotubes determines a tremendous range of electronic behavior. Carbon nanotubes can be insulating, can be semiconducting, and can even be superconducting. And something quite small as a carbon nanotube yet produces extraordinary electronic properties. To your right is a nanocrystal, or we also called quantum dot. This is an image of a nanocrystal or quantum dot that was synthesized by Paul Alvazados, and it's 5 nanometers in width. And these are interesting because at a certain scale of dimension, the optical properties of the material depend on the size, not necessarily on the intrinsic composition. And for aggregates of atoms that are so small, these nanocrystals are remarkably optically efficient. And being that particular size, not only their unusual optical properties, but their size lends them to important new applications. Now, what's also interesting about the icons that I've shown you is I've very conveniently divided them into sort of characteristic fields. DNA, biology, I don't think anyone would argue that. Carbon nanotubes have come out of the chemistry community, and quantum dots, well, share ownership between physics and chemistry. And so that's part of the what's new. It's not only that we have accessible to us a number of nanostructured building blocks with exceptional properties that we can then mix and match, but these building blocks come to us, and they're by now familiar to us, from a variety of different scientific disciplines, formerly disparate disciplines. So I think Barbara has mentioned this before, part of what's new is convergence. In one sense, and this is perhaps a little bit too optimistic, but this diagram that Horst Stormer put together initially shows the steady progress of a variety of different scientific disciplines, biology, physics, materials science, chemistry. It's just a partial showing, marching from the macroscopic, an organism, a vacuum tube, a large-scale crystal, a large-scale compound, down to the nanoscale, single atoms, DNA, molecularly designed structures. And so in a sense, we're coming to a convergence in time, a convergence in understanding made possible by commonality of instrumentation that brings us to a point. And as we come to a convergence of understanding, a convergence in understanding the possibilities of what we can do at this point in time with our understanding, with our instrumentation, and therefore come to common interests or convergence of interests. In a way, this is something like the nanotechnology version of The World is Flat, which is, how many of you here who have read The World is Flat? So this is a very interesting premise, a fascinating book that was recently written by Tom Friedman. A flattened world, meaning a world, our world today, that is globally interconnected, information streaming 24/7, web-enabled, a level playing field that's made level because now everybody has access to information, critical information, and without regard for geographical distance, time distance, or soon even language, can collaborate on a worldwide basis. Now, Friedman listed 10 flatteners, and I'm not going to go over them. 10 critical issues that led to the flattened world we see today. But rather than going through them, I'll just come to a quote from his book that clearly this kind of world that we live in today, where you may order something on the phone, a critical item, and be speaking to an operator in India and receive the item the next day, this flattening the world undoubtedly has changed the rules, roles, and relationships of the way we interact more quickly than we could have imagined. So obviously, this is embedded in society. This influences our daily life. This information explosion, the technology which led to it, and the technology that continues it, obviously has an effect on the way science is done, and in particular nanotechnology. So I just listed a few nanotechnology flatteners. And some of those flatteners are flatteners or information, ways of information exchange across boundaries that have been true of science perhaps since its inception, and have become more true as the technological means have been made available to make it more true. Free exchange of ideas and results, sharing of ideas across geographical boundaries, increasingly rapid communications. That's part of the environment that influences us all as information technology increases its capability. Common tools, and common tools that are made available on a widespread basis. Global access to information and results in an almost instantaneous manner, and something that will become increasingly important, and which is something I think that we're working on developing most closely right now, scientists and engineers learning to speak each other's language, describing the world in the same way. And for those of you who don't work in science and engineering, and for whom, because we don't particularly do a good job in communicating what we do, feel that all science and all engineering is the same, so why bother with nuances or dialects? Those nuances or dialects are important, and those nuances and dialects that we all speak are impediments to the sharing of ideas. So what will the flattened world of nanotechnology look like? And what I have listed on the right-hand side are some of the promises that many of you who've studied nanotechnology have already heard about. Materials stronger than steel but a fraction of the weight, that gives rise to better opportunities for transportation, better roads, and flying cars. Energy-efficient lighting sources, new energy sources, new kinds of batteries, augmented communications and information access, new medical therapies and individual medical monitors. Barbara pointed out a wide number of areas of impact that nanotechnology has promise in. And I think there is a strong basis for every single one of these claims, and in fact I show you, in this case, this is a diagnostic lab in a pill. You swallow this, there's a camera and a wireless transmitter so that you can send images of your gastrointestinal tract with minimal invasion. So those are the promises. And with such widespread promises and such potential for transformation of society, the pervasiveness, first of all, mandates that we take a very careful look at this set of technologies and how, in turn, this flattened world will evolve or develop. But there are aspects of this pervasiveness, this intense concentration on this new possibility at the very small, that makes us worry a bit. For example, you might wonder, with nanotechnology promising to have a role in every feature of your life, is it a panacea? Can it be a panacea? And here's an example of one claim, one article of nanotech enlisted to battle bird flu. So I was about to give a talk in a public forum several months ago, and the person who invited me to give a talk sent me some information about the location of the talk and the time and so on. And then as part of his email, he said, by the way, could you talk about this? And he had just found this article on nanotech and bird flu, so I diligently looked up and saw what could be done. This article actually made the claim that this is an example of one of the viruses that has been identified as being responsible for avian flu. And the dimensions of the virus are actually 10 nanometers wide by 100 nanometers long. And I think the article, although it states it can be controversial, talked about, well, if it's nanometers in size, maybe we can just filter it out. And that's the magic of nanotechnology. So I have to say that it isn't entirely impossible that not that you should bring all your sores and all your problems, your plaints, your trials to the foot of nanotechnology and hope that it'll be cured. But yes, there is a basis. The basis is not just that because of its size, you filter it through a nanoscale colander and you'll get rid of the virus. The potential of nanotechnology is actually more sophisticated than that, and therefore requires a little bit more thought. What you do need to address this problem in rapid fashion is to have the capabilities of a sophisticated biotech lab. In fact, the capabilities of multiple biotech labs working in parallel for rapid identification, be able to take in data rapidly and do the analysis, carry out rapid screening, and screaming if it hurts, to target the identification and destruction of the virus. And you want to do it on the size of a computer chip that fits into an iPod Nano. And that's the power of nanotechnology. And those various components, the biochemical, the biomedical, the electronic, the physics, those are all important components in defining this new nanotechnology. On the other hand, because so much has been promised and so much has been given and therefore so much is expected, one might say, is it anticlimactic? Is this a bunch of hype? I've heard the word hype used many times contiguous to nanotechnology. And just to perhaps bear out my point, I'm showing you a slide of images that were selected from Forbes' top 10 nanotech products for 2004. And basically what you see is a nanoporous aerogel for foot warmers, a number of nano-based treatments of surface to make them hydrophobic, or here's another version, Clarity Fender repels rain, self-cleaning surfaces. The carbon nanotubes in golf clubs, I don't really know how that would improve your game, and I have no idea what the self-correcting golf balls are. There are new concoctions of nano-based structures for skin care. And then when I talked about silver Band-Aids, I actually meant this product, EcoTrue Nanosilver Wound Dressing. And the premise behind that is that silver can serve as an antimicrobial, antibacterial agent, but not in the bulk. And I'm not sure that it's clear what the mechanism is. Part of the use of nanosilver composites or nanosilver salts certainly must arise from the larger surface area that results, but this is a nanosilver wound dressing. So if you look at this, the top 10 nanotech products for 2004, you might lose heart. There's a lot of investment going in, and if all it's going to give you is a better foot warmer, maybe we should quit right now. But I would say there is a tremendous capacity for transformative science, and I just want to show you two examples that may or may not catch your imagination, but it catches mine. One is using proteins as templates to make batteries, real batteries, lightweight batteries, and batteries that actually behave even more efficiently than the way present batteries of this kind are made. This is work done by one of my colleagues, Angela Belcher at MIT, and her colleagues there. And Angela was a graduate student and postdoc here at MIT, here at UCSB. And basically, the premise is this: she takes viruses. She uses that to template various component materials that will be effective in doing charge separation and storage, which is the essence of how the battery will work. She then uses them and clusters them together into assemblies, and then finally uses that as part of a lithium-ion battery where the cathode is a lithium foil, there's an electrolyte, and this is your viral battery. So to give you a little bit more insight into that, the structure here, this is the template. And the template has been used to nucleate a cobalt oxide and gold, a metal, and used to place those two nanocrystalline materials, the oxide and the metal, in close proximity to each other at a nanoscale. And that proximity is defined by the natural symmetry of the protein coat around the virus. So this is a hybrid material that does not occur in nature, that would otherwise be difficult to make and to order. And this is an actual transmission electron micrograph that shows the gold nanoparticles, but in the background, which you can't clearly see, is evidence of the cobalt oxide nanocrystals as well. This is an example of how these viruses will cluster up and form an ordered film that forms one component of the battery. So the virus allows you to create a hybrid material that gives you greater efficiency in battery action. You can carry out ordering at the nanoscale because you have the natural template of the protein code of the virus. This goes on at low temperature. It's therefore a green method of an environmentally friendly method of putting together a battery. It goes on efficiently, and in fact, what these data do show, although I won't go into it, is that you could actually get improved battery characteristics or capacity compared to another way of forming it that didn't use the biological agent. I'll show you one more example of work that was done published in 2000. This was work done by Carlo Montemagno, who was at Cornell at the time, and Harold Craighead at Cornell. Carlo subsequently went to UCLA, and now he's at University of Cincinnati, I believe. And here's an interesting idea. We talk about the need for energy and sources of energy. Efficient, compact, lightweight, and hopefully energy that comes from different sources than burning fossil fuel or using perhaps even electrical power. Well, we all operate thanks to chemical interactions. I'm standing before you today with a certain degree of animation because in my body is the transfer of adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate back and forth. So living organisms generate energy, the energy of motion, the energy of life, through chemical pathways. And what these researchers have done have made a hybrid biomotor or energy generator using as the basis, this is a protein. It's also an enzyme. It's called F1-ATPase. It happens to have multiple components, and this is this protein coming through the middle with the exchange, with the chemical reaction exchange of charge, actually undergoes a rotary motion. And what these researchers did was take this as the basis, modified it a bit, so that they could attach their own nickel rotors and place this protein onto a pedestal, making this hybrid biomotor. Now, this is not going to drive your car. It's not going to let Chris go on a flying trip over LA. But it's a proof of principle that there are other ways that we can explore. There are ways that there are analogs that we can learn from that could provide energy through different means, and perhaps energy in a way that is more efficient, more environmentally friendly. So what will the flattened world of nanotechnology look like? It's a world where the issues of science and technology more than ever affect us all, where understanding the societal context, the global implications, the ability to consult, communicate, and learn become ever more important. It's a world where the CNS, I think, is absolutely mandatory. Thank you.
Now, I told Chris McCrae when he invited me to come talk that I was likely to embarrass myself a little bit. And he said, well, that's okay. He doesn't, because I must say that I've been sort of cool about nanotechnology. And I will start with an anecdote sort of a story I'm telling on myself from a couple of years ago. I was at the National Academy of Sciences giving a talk and sharing the podium with Rick Weiss from the Washington Post. And somebody asked a question, so what is the next really big story coming along in science? And somebody said, nanotechnology? I said, I don't think so. And Rick Weiss says, really? I really do think so. And I sort of, we sort of have had an informal bet about this ever since. It's not to say that nanotechnology is unimportant, that I think it's unimportant, but there's a difference between what's important and what's news. You know, a lot of things that affect our lives, plastics, the increasing acceleration of how small you can get microchips to be and so on. Those are obviously important things in our lives, but they're also invisible. We don't do a story saying, oh, microchips now smaller and faster than ever. I mean, how often could we do that story? I guess the next time we'll do that story is microchips no longer getting smaller and faster than ever, but it looks like we have a few years to go on that one. So, so I started getting nervous. It's like, well, is Rick right? Am I right? It's always a little bit troublemaking to do this. And I also realized that Rick sort of has an advantage, because if Rick decides it's news, then he can write stories about it. They end up in the Washington Post, and hey, it's news. So it's a sucker bet in some way. But at any rate, I'm still feeling uncomfortable about really how much of this is real, how much of this is hype, and how much of this I'm just falling behind by not paying enough attention to. And when Patrick asked me to give this talk, I thought, okay, well, here's a great opportunity for me to at least explore a little bit. Have I been too cavalier on this topic? And maybe it does take more news, or more attention than I'm giving it, and that NPR is giving it. And I think one indication was, of course, I found out immediately that the federal government has kicked in more than $1 billion in the FY07 budget for nanotechnology. So somebody thinks it's important, and the question is, why is that going on? And that I don't have a complete answer for. But I think the other thing that I thought clearly, regardless of this, of how important it is or how newsworthy it is, clearly the social issues that underpin so many other things in science and technology, that any excuse you can get to get funding to think about these issues and study these issues is all for the best, whether or not nanotechnology is this real looming enormous thing, or whether it is just a wonderful example of something that gives you an opportunity to go into it. So I'm going to be a little bit skeptical today, and I hope that people can throw virtual tomatoes, maybe nano tomatoes, at me if I say things that I should be scolded for. I probably will, and we can take it from there. So, well, let me just start with the basics, which is the definition of nanotech. Things between 1 and 100 nanometers tall, bugs me to begin with. It sounds so clean and so simple, but it is actually muddling. I think it's a catch-all. And I think about, chemistry has always been at that scale. So, okay, so are we sweeping together chemistry on the one hand? And what about on the other hand? Computer technology, of course, has been moving slowly and steadily down towards those scales. So these days, I guess the best chips are about 90 nanometer widths and so on. And so the question is, okay, did something magical happen with computer technology when it went from 120 nanometer scale to 90 nanometer scale, and all of a sudden it's nanotechnology? And I'm unconvinced that really was it's fun when you're driving your car and you've passed 100,000 miles. It's really exciting, but is your car really different? And I remain unconvinced that magic barrier has really done anything. The other thing that I'm very curious about are some of the claims about what nanotechnology is going to be like for us. The trade industry says by 2014 it expects that 15% of manufacturing will be nanotechnology, and it'll be the financial output will be $2.6 trillion in products. Well, those are big numbers. Those are very impressive things. But again, the question is this the result of recategorizing everything little as nanotechnology, chemistry, biochemistry, chip making as nanotechnology, or is this really new and different and unusual stuff? And I don't know the answer. Maybe I should have looked it up, but it might have made my talk less interesting if I actually knew the answer. But I suspect there's a little bit of financial sleight of hand going on here. Now, okay, so what is nanotechnology stuff already out there? And Evelyn showed some of those products. Apparently, there's a list of 200 products now that are on the market, supposedly, although this was the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. did this analysis and said, that's the best they could come up with. But then they had some very important caveats, which I think the caveats are more interesting than the numbers. One of the first things they said is, of course, we can't really tell you whether these really are nano products or not. These are just claims of that these companies have made that these are actually these products. So what does that tell me? Well, it tells me that they are thus far indistinguishable from ordinary products. So is this revolutionary if you can't really tell the difference? And the other thing it tells me is that there's a problem here of possibly hype, possibly credibility, and so on. And that needs to get sorted out. And I don't know exactly how that will get sorted out. And I guess the broader question is, should I care if my sunscreen, for example, is a product of nanotechnology or ordinary chemistry? As long as I don't get sunburned, it doesn't make that much of a difference to me. And I think that there have been allusions to the fact that some of the products or some of the properties of nanotechnology really should allow us to do wonderful new things because the properties are unique and they're not in our current realm, and it will be wonderful to get to that point. But as a journalist, I'm waiting for a really clear example of that, and so far it is not forthcoming. That's not to say people aren't trying. I got a press release from MIT the other day, and I'll read you the first paragraph of it. It says, ultra-small particles loaded with medicine and aimed with the precision of a rifle are offering a promising new way to strike at cancer, according to researchers working at MIT and Brigham and Women's Hospital. So I thought, oh, gee, this sounds familiar to me somehow. Precision of a rifle sounds like magic bullet, sounds like monoclonal antibodies, sounds like rhetoric of the 1970s and early 1980s. So, and the other thing was, when you read into the press release, it's actually tiny little nanoparticles filled with medicine, which sounds cool. But then I thought, now wait a second. When I was in college, I had a friend who was in medical school, and she got extremely excited about the research she was doing, and she told me about the stuff she was doing with these things called liposomes, which are tiny little nanoscale particles filled with medicine that go into and cross cell membranes and so on. So this was 1980, and so all of a sudden it's these, they are obviously, they didn't cure cancer 20 years ago. Maybe MIT will have better luck this time around, but it's interesting how these stories tend to get recycled and increase my level of suspicion about how much of this is really new and different. The other thing that I think about a little bit is you clearly can go out and buy nano-fabricated stuff easily today. In fact, a friend of mine actually went out and ordered a little primer of DNA, which you can get custom made that spelled things out. So he had a little vial of DNA that, if you actually decoded the DNA using the alphabet that you use to encode amino acids, you could actually spell out "Dear Mom, I love you" or whatever, and send your mom a little vial of DNA. So obviously people do it for more useful things than that. But the point is that technology has been out there for a while to fabricate things on a couple nanometer scale, and it's cool and it's wonderful, but this is what I always thought of as molecular biology or biotechnology, and drawing a sharp distinction between that and nanotechnology, I'm a little bit skeptical about that. We have taken a couple of stabs at nanotechnology, and I will tell a story about my colleague David Kessenbaum, who did a story a couple of years ago about he put on some nanotechnology sunscreen, he put on some nanotechnology togs, and he went out to play tennis using a special tennis racket that was nanotechnology tennis racket that actually was apparently considerably stiffer than the standard tennis racket, although David found that he had just as many double faults with this tennis racket as he did with an ordinary tennis racket. But then there was a little exchange in his story, which I will share with you. He was talking, when all was said and done, he talked to a guy named Howard Brody, who's at the University of Pennsylvania, who told him, well, carbon nanotubes are going for $500 a gram. So David was trying to figure out what is the magic in this tennis racket. And of course, the manufacturer was cagey, didn't want to say, so he goes to Howard Brody. And David says, well, that's funny. The nanotech racket costs just $200. So if it's $500 a gram, and the tennis racket itself costs $200, and I think it's fair to say weighs more than a gram. Mr. Brody says, well, which means that the amount of nanotubes in a racket is at most a small fraction of a gram. Question, is that small fraction of a gram doing very much good? Answer, probably not. And David then says, a spokesman for Babolat, the company that makes this, says the company gets its nanotubes below cost, but could not track down the specific quantity of nanotubes in the racket in time for the story. Maybe if you called back today, he'd get another answer. I don't know. But at any rate, there are other such anecdotes I remember hearing on our air. Somebody being extremely excited about nanotechnology coating that is for clothes to make it stain resistant. I thought, gee, that sounds like Scotchgard. Of course, well, that's actually an interesting parallel, because Scotchgard turned out not to be such a great treat after all. And some of the chemicals involved in manufacturing Scotchgard turned out to be pretty nasty, and Scotchgard was ultimately taken off the market. So that is actually an important warning flag for what nanotechnology might have to be on the lookout for. So okay, so I'm sounding cynical, hard-boiled journalist that I am, and I do have to say that anticipating the future is hard, and I shouldn't have too much hubris about being able to do it any better than anyone else can, because I know I can't. So the question really, though, for me is, as I'm approaching a story like this, is trying to decide, is this really like one of the first stories I did at NPR when I got there almost 20 years ago, talking about high-temperature superconductors. This was a significant and interesting advance in the field of physics, and everyone started saying, oh, well, gee, it's going to transform the world. Not everyone, but there was certainly a drumbeat for that, and my editors were complaining that I wasn't talking enough about magnetically levitated trains and all the ways the world would be transformed. And I said, I don't think that that magnetic levitation is really what is stopping trains from taking off in the U.S. But these things start to take a life of their own, and high-temperature superconductors, I mean, obviously have a small but important niche these days, but did not turn out to be the transformative technology that some people were hoping or claiming or wishing that it would end up being. The cynical journalist in me says, well, whenever a new idea comes across and comes along, almost all of them are wrong. So if you were just a betting person, you could just sort of bet they were all wrong. Of course, the problem with that is that the 5% that are right are the interesting ones. The 95% that are wrong, you don't really care about that. But so the question is, how do you go about picking, the cold fusion ones, being one of the wrong ones? How do you go about figuring out in advance which of these are going to be wrong and right? And it is really tricky. And I think the history people here can tell you much better than I can. It's the history of the laser, for example. How when it first came along, I think people just it was curious, it was interesting, but it was not at all obvious that it would be in our supermarkets and our CD players and all the rest of that stuff for a long time. And I think, the chip, I think the computer chip, I think people had a little bit more of an inkling that this is going to be the beginning of a revolution in information sciences, which obviously it has been. But I wonder if, I doubt that anyone back then could have gotten anywhere close to guessing what Tom Friedman was talking about in his book about the world being flat, that the information technology could lead in such a dramatic way to such profound social changes across the planet. And so it's, you got to try. And I think these folks are brave for taking this on and trying. But I think that I have to have some humility about not dismissing stories too easily. And I think that the historians and social scientists and so on have to be careful about, trying to really explore where the horizon, what's over the horizon, which is always tough to do. So anyway, I'm going to skip a little bit of this stuff here. let me turn to the social issues a little bit. I think a very interesting pattern or sort of example of this that I think was highly successful was the Human Genome Project. And when the Human Genome Project came along, they very deliberately said, we're going to set aside a significant chunk of their money, 5 to 10%, well, 3 to 5%, I guess, of the budget of the Human Genome Project for social, ethical, and legal issues having to do with the genome. And I think it turned out to be an excellent use of funding and an excellent way to really think about what are we doing here by sequencing the human genome. What are the issues that are coming along? And I think the one reason that exercise is still ongoing, is so successful, is that they did a really clear and good job of defining what the questions were and exploring them. For example, looking at the role of genetics and health discrimination. I mean, an incredibly important question. Looking at genetics and race, how much we want to say about, or how do we go about exploring these very difficult issues about race and genetics? Do we want to, what if the answer is that there are huge genetic differences? What if the answer is there are no real genetic differences between the races and so on? How do you go about exploring this around the world without offending people and reducing people to a bundle of genes and so on? They talked about genetics and behavior. That's an issue that people are still afraid to wade into because it is so highly charged. Genetics, the whole genome and intellectual property. Should we patent these genes? What do we do with this intellectual property? Who owns the genome? They talked about genetics and employment discrimination and genetics and clinical trials. So I think that it was the whole enterprise was put together with a great deal of thought and really cleanly defined questions. So I said, okay, so what are the questions in nanotechnology that encapsulate these questions too? And I must say, maybe I didn't do my research very well, but I'm not finding a very satisfactory, coherent list of questions like that can be broken down and digested and so on. I think the first thing I came across was, I remember reading Bill Joy's article in Wired magazine in the year 2000. Obviously not the first really big hand-wringing exercise about nanotechnology, but certainly one of the most celebrated ones. He was the founder of Sun Microsystems and was obviously getting extremely agitated about what the future could look like with nanotechnology and related technologies. And he painted an extremely grim and scary future for the planet and basically said, let's stop this. Maybe I'll just read a very short excerpt from the article. He says, an immediate consequence of the Faustian bargain in obtaining the great power of nanotechnology is that we run a grave risk, the risk that we might destroy the biosphere on which all life depends. It's okay, well, that's worth worrying about if it's really a real worry. I grant him that, but it somehow it lacks the focus and the definition of some of the ethical and social questions that came up with the Genome Project. I mean, how do you go about saying, well, are we going to destroy the biosphere or not? And I think this was the fear that gray goo would come along and self-replicating machines would come along and replicate themselves and take over the world, and then they'd eat us. They'd not only eat our lunch, but they'd eat us as well, I guess. And to which I thought, okay, well, that's something you can worry about. But if you really want to worry about human creations doing nasty things, I think you'd be much better off worrying about creating novel life forms that could do all sorts of nonsense, because life forms clearly already know how to replicate. So if you're worried about self-replicating things, it's a much better starting product, a much better system to work with as living organisms, as opposed to little machines that you make and then hope that they can keep replicating themselves. So other concerns about sort of the downside of this. Human enhancement is another thing that's been mentioned. I guess we're thinking about bionic people or various things like that. I think, okay, well, that's might be good, might be bad. I'm not sure that's automatically something that we should be petrified about. But I also think that it's also not a very specific worry for nanotechnology. I mean, what about gene therapy or germline gene therapy, where you not only make a change in yourself, but you make it so it passes on to future generations? What about more prosaic things we're doing today, steroids and sports, caffeine at school. I mean, is that human enhancement? Is that bad? I don't know. I had a cup of coffee before I came in, so I guess it's not too bad. What about private schools? I mean, that's human enhancement. Is that giving giving unfair advantage to people who happen to be born into wealthy parents? So I don't know. I mean, these are important social issues, and I'm not trying to belittle the important issues that are underlying them. I'm just thinking, okay, is this really a nanotechnology worry, or is this a more generalized worry that we need to think about? The other one that comes up occasionally is privacy, and with super small computers, how much privacy will we have left? And it's like, well, how much do we have left already? I was just in this building where people were being iris scanned to go into a laboratory, which is, I suppose, not too invasive, but I don't know. I must say, I had felt a little bit creepy about the thought that university would have my iris scan on file so that they could track me coming and going from the building. I guess they'd also have my bank account number so that every time I went in, they could immediately take the charges out as well. But again, important privacy issues, very important issues, but are there unique parts of nanotechnology that are going to make this worse than they are? Interesting question. Maybe it's a question certainly worth exploring. In the course of looking into this, I decided I should have a little bit of information, not just talk sheerly from my own ignorance. And I did manage to read an article by Bruce Lewinstein, who is on the advisory committee of this organization, actually, and he goes through what are the social issues, and he also had a really hard time coming up with defining some of the social issues. He says, at the same time that I'll quote from his recently published paper, at the same time that we congratulate the nano community for embracing studies of social and ethical issues, we should be wary of the attempt to draw boundaries between those issues and technical ones. He goes on to say, virtually every argument in this paper would hold if the words biotechnology or information science or cognitive science were substituted for nanotechnology. So again, I think it's the issues are really broad, and I think it's wonderful that if there's an opportunity to address them. I think that nano may find itself gradually growing and growing into realizing that every time you take on something like this, it's nano and other stuff as well. So, but okay, so those. I've been too dismissive because there clearly are a few issues that are uniquely or almost unique to nanotechnology. And one is the health issues, particularly of the nano part of nanotechnology that are these superfine particles. And Rick Weiss at the Washington Post has indeed followed this thread with great care, and I'm glad somebody has. I guess this is my failing for having sort of been a little bit too dismissive of it, but he's been looking into these issues of, are there unique health hazards, particularly the people who are working with nanoparticles, these super fine particles? And the answer is yes, and particulates. And the trend in the field has been realizing that smaller particles go deeper in the lungs and can do more bad things to you, or have the potential to at any rate. So in some ways, it's a continuation of this trend of realizing that we need to pay attention to smaller and smaller particles. And now that there are people actually manufacturing these things in tiny particles, what do you need to have as a respirator to protect you from 10 nanometer particles or whatever they are? And that's. I think that's a really clear and focused question that needs to be addressed and is belatedly starting to be addressed. Another one is nanotechnology in food. Apparently, there's not too much going into it right now, but if nanoparticles do have unique properties, if they do different things than just regular chemicals do, then you definitely need to understand that whether you're ingesting them through the air or whether you're ingesting them with food. And I think that's a very serious issue that I think is just beginning to be explored right now. And I think the feeling is, I mean, there is a generic aspect to that as well, which is that the Food and Drug Administration, one could argue, has not really done a very good job of really dealing with any new kinds of foods coming along. Their biotech foods so far have not proven problematic, but you know, the feeling is that they're not necessarily, they're a little bit too relaxed about what's going on and how much we really have to think and worry about those things. So maybe nanotechnology will help the FDA realize we really do need to think more carefully about how we go about making sure that foods are safe. The words are all there in the right place, but the actions, I don't think, well, the actions make a fair number of people nervous at any rate. So, and we've already seen, you know, product recall in Europe from one of these cleaning products that was supposedly a nano product. I don't know if anyone actually knows it was a nano product, but it clearly caused some health reactions to people who breathed it in. So I mean, these are really real issues. I guess my fear or my worry is that some of this is being inspired not out of genuine concern for understanding how society works and has to deal with these technologies, but sort of trying to make sure that nanotechnology isn't slowed down too much by people who raise concerns that may or may not be well grounded. And I'm thinking in terms of the regulators, of course, are well aware of the whole debacle in Europe when genetically modified foods were brought in with very little fanfare, and Greenpeace and others very successfully was able to label them frankenfoods and to create a great deal of public anxiety about these foods. And you know, we happily eat genetically modified everything in this country without much fuss. Not everything, but I mean, some of the major crops, corn is largely genetically modified, and the cotton. Not that we're eating cotton, but that you know, so many of the crops in this country are based on that. And the story was so different in Europe, and the feeling was, well, gee, if we had sort of managed the expectations of this better, maybe we could have avoided that in Europe. And the question is this a? And I think on the one hand that's probably true. I guess on the other hand, the question is, does that mean that you really want an open and honest and full conversation, or do you want to, or is it a little more cynical, saying we'll have the public discussion maybe at a time when it's really boring and people will say, okay, this is a boring discussion, this can't be a big deal, and go on and go on with their lives? Or is this something more akin to the Asilomar Conference in 1976, when people really did sit down and say, what is genetic engineering really going to mean for us? And I think that was an example of a really serious and thoughtful conversation, and I think that was really a good model to aspire to. So anyway, after having this sort of brainstorm of semi-random thoughts, I was sort of thinking, well, what can a center like this do? What should it do? And I have a few suggestions, if you don't mind. And I think one thing is, it would be lovely if there could be a way to sharpen the definition of nanotechnology. It's hard for an academic institution or anyone else to do it, but I think definitions are so important, and I think that this one stinks. I really don't like it. I think that it lumps too many things together. It confuses so many things, and it's not helpful. It's great for marketing. It's really horrible for society, I think, to really understand these things. I think you should aspire to have a list of issues that is as sharp and as clear as the Human Genome Project managed to come up with considerable deliberation and more money than you guys have. So maybe the NSF could kick in a few more bucks, and you could. But I think that list really helped clarify and focus the discussion of the human genome in a remarkable way. And I think that those are all. Every one of those questions are questions that we've done stories about, we've dealt with, and because they are interesting, they're complex, they're well stated, and they're really clearly defined. And I think that they touch people in very explicit ways. It's not this sort of, oh my God, green goo is going to, or gray goo is going to take over the earth, but it's very specific. And I think that it's always great for academia to come in and ask the big questions. Obviously, so much of this technology is being driven by commercial interest, by what the question is really, what will be profitable? Well, that's obviously an important question, but I also think it's not the only question we should be asking, and certainly as a society, it's not necessarily even the first question we should be asking. Well, the people who are out to make money clearly need to understand that. I think you guys need to ask questions, what can we aspire to, whether it's flying cars or whether it's, what are the big issues? Social justice, energy was alluded to a little bit here. How can this be used to improve human health? I mean, that's obviously sometimes profit-driven, sometimes not a profit-driven question. So, I think, and I think even in the fact that there is a muddle about how many of these issues are really unique to nanotechnology, I think that this is an entryway into asking the big questions. And I find, I've been reporting about science for 20 years for NPR, and as often as I come back to sort of a meta question, and I have a lesson that I'm trying to teach people. It doesn't matter if it's an astronomy story or a biology story or what it is, but what I'm always hoping to sneak in a little bit is to explain to people how science works, how the scientific method works, how scientists think, and there's some sort of broader issue that's going on here. There's some sort of there's a meta lesson, if you will, hiding behind. And so even if the topic is occasionally a little bit flimsy or ill-defined or so on, I can still find a way to sneak in those meta issues. And I know that your fields are based on thinking about those big questions, and I hope that you can use nanotechnology as a way to get at them and to I guess the word is it's a teachable moment. It's somewhat of a parallel, and I hope you guys can do it. So anyway, I wish you the best, and